I'm Jeff Gursky.
I'm Craig Allen.
Today is a continuation of a previous video we made on active shooter response and integration. The intent of this video is to take some of those components and break them down a little bit into finer detail.
Jeff, you're right. There's been a lot of good work going on nationally with this program. But what we're finding is there's still a lot of work to do. We've spoken to a lot of agencies out there. And I think what it comes down to is we recognize police and fire that we have to integrate, but it's how do we integrate? And what does that integration look like? And how is that going to be sustainable for our agencies?
And as we choose a response model, it's important to understand the impacts it's going to have on our departments. What's the training required? How do we implement protocols? And more importantly, is it sustainable? Because if we choose a complex model that is only for one type of event, the chance is it might be burdensome for our departments.
So let's have an update about what's going on with active shooters. 2014 is on track to be an all-time record-setting year. Just about a month ago in our jurisdiction, there was a high school shooter that came in, ended up killing a student, wounding a teacher. Luckily, 2 SROs were on site and was able to quickly mitigate that shooting. But let's go back and look at it a little bit more historically. The average time these take has been around 12 to 13 minutes. But if we look from 2007, 2008 forward, the average time they're occurring in under 5 minutes. So again, the speed at which these active shooters are occurring are blindingly fast. So that again puts the pressure on police and fire to be able to have a meaningful integration and get in there and save lives. But when we look at these integration models, here's a key point: the rumors of a second shooter and the implications that have on how we integrate. If we look historically, there's only really been 2 incidents. Of course, Columbine and Jonesboro, Arkansas. Yes, the Boston bombing was a 2-person shooter. The Malvo brothers in D.C. were, and so were the Good Friday massacre. But those had a different angle on them. But if we look at how do we integrate with public safety, with the information coming in on the radio in those first 10 to 15 minutes of a second shooter, will fire be able to come in? Will Unified Command give fire permission to come in when there is rumors of a second shooter? But we know predominantly that's not going to be the case, but the question is, how certain are we in those first 10 to 15 minutes when rumors run high of a second shooter that we're able to bring fire in? That's what we want to take a look at. Let me see if I can be a little bit more specific. The question is, when rumors are running high of a second shooter, will fire come in? And if they do come into an embedded warm zone, will they then go out in rescue teams and start to retrieve patients? I think that's a difficult question. I think that's a difficult thing to ask of our fire counterparts. What we feel is a better option when rumors are running high of that second shooter, to pull fire into a protected embedded warm zone where they're able to conduct their business while police continue their business on the inside of the structure, pulling victims in, continue the mitigation of threat, locking down corridors, etc. And that's the critical difference that you see with our model as opposed to some others out there, is that we believe that police can pull the patients into a protected warm zone where fire can do their business.
To cover incident friction, the way we should be looking at incident friction, so every time that we run into points where we're not operating smoothly, these are ultimately time penalties that affect our mortality rates of our victims. That's why we need to ahead of time kind of pre-plan these areas where these friction points may be coming from and remove them. And some of these friction points are, public safety not acting united. I don't think it's going to be a surprise in anybody, nationally, that cops are still acting like cops and firefighters are still acting like firefighters. It's important because we have several thousand taxpayers out there that are expecting a public safety response, that we come together as a united public safety. This doesn't mean that we need to be joint police and fire all the time. We just need to be able to come together and work seamlessly. A condition of our SOPs and our SOGs is another important fact. There are lots of departments across America that are making their SOPs or SOGs an active shooter. It's important that these SOPs and SOGs actually work. Sometimes what looks good on paper might not actually be practically applicable. And lastly, our tradition and culture. There's an old saying that the fire service is 200 years of tradition, not impeded by progress. And I'm sure that we could probably find that on the law enforcement side. They have a similar saying. It's important that we have to understand that culture and tradition are important, but should not impede our success of how we move forward to mitigate such an incident. It's important to note that there are a lot of agencies out there that have great plans on paper, but when they have never been tested, may ultimately fall apart, especially if we're not trying to preload our own success. So it's important that whatever SOPs or SOGs we come up with, that one, we kind of have a theory of how they should work. Two, they're tested. Three, they're revised. Then ultimately, we come together with a joint integrated policy. The real-world testing of these protocols or procedures or guidelines doesn't have to be expensive, and we don't have to, think outside the box. Most oftentimes, we have a foundational response that we can build upon that can be inclusive to this response type. Ultimately, the active shooter response is a zone response, and we're very familiar in fire and law enforcement with zone responses, especially if we apply it to something like hazardous materials, where we have our hot zone, which is exclusion, our warm zone, which is reduction, or our cold zone, which is our support. Ultimately, an active shooter event is going to be a hot zone, right? And the problem is that on all the after actions that we find out there, this is the #1 common problem that departments have, is fire and EMS wondering when they can go into a structure and waiting essentially for it to be clear. Now, as we talk about a little bit later on, and as we talked about in the previous video, we can find a way to engineer these zones to make all responding parties more comfortable. And for us to move forward as departments and agencies and individuals, we have to understand kind of the context of what we're responding to. Now we can look at the WDMET studies, which come from the military, which we talked about in the previous video. But to talk a little bit more about penetrating trauma and how it relates to us, we can look at an Orange County trauma study that looked at out-of-hospital scene times and transport times. Now, this study was conducted in the Orange County area at a level 1 trauma hospital. It was conducted over 14 years and had roughly 19,000 patients. What they looked at was blunt and penetrating traumas, which penetrating traumas especially applies to us, an active shooter. The results that they found were astonishing. They found that there was an increased mortality rate with scene times that were equal to or greater than 20 minutes. So how does this apply to us? Well, as we come into an active shooter event and we're 30 minutes behind, we've already gone past this greater than or equal to 20 minutes. So as we move forward as agencies, we have to understand what are the key things that we can do to help speed up our initial response and come through and transport these people to definitive care. Because the definitive care, especially outlined in this study, is the key to success. As we dive further into this study, it brings up a philosophical question. Do we stay and play, or do we scoop and run? Now, this study really does highlight that more lives are saved when we do scoop and run. So that is the key difference between the model that we're talking to you about today, the rapid response treatment model versus the other models out there. Instead of over-engineering a response, what we're saying is use our foundational principles we have as departments and come in there for a blitz response to extricate patients as quickly as possible, opposed to going through the building of the structure and just picking certain patients one at a time, which may take a little bit longer.
As we have looked at numerous after-action studies and some of the wounding patterns that go with these incidents to include numerous medical studies, what has just became really clear is that we have to, police and fire, engineer a response to this active shooter event. Law enforcement, again, has done a great job mitigating that threat on the front end. We've made great strides in that, as we've seen here just a month ago at the school in Portland, Oregon. But that life-saving timeline continues, meaning that those people that are in the structure that are wounded, we need to get them to definitive medical care. So again, we need to have a meaningful impact with how we work with our fire counterparts in getting them in there. And only until we can marry both of those disciplines, police and fire, well, I think we will have the greatest impact on that life-saving timeline.
Just as Craig just talked about with law enforcement goals, EMS has goals too that are data-driven. Number one, we need to access the patients as quickly as possible. Number two, we need to address only the critical, fixable injuries on scene. And number three, we need to get the patients to definitive care as quickly as possible. And definitive care essentially is the operating room table, where the highest efficiency in mortality survivability is found. To touch on how we're responding, if public safety was a business, and that is law enforcement, fire and EMS, we would probably be fired because we're not looking at our data and engineering our response accordingly. So how do we engineer a response? Now, it might be unknown to a lot of departments, but we might be able to use our current response resources to operate efficiently. An example would be, how do we respond to a domestic assault, where law enforcement goes in, kind of clears the scene, and allows fire and EMS? Now, we might be able to use that foundational response and build upon it, which makes our response even more simpler, which we'll talk about later. But it's important that we're not distracted by tactics and gear. Ultimately, and I'm a tech rescue nerd, I love systems. I love buying additional tripods and gear for whatever response we may have. But it's not the gear or the tactics that makes us efficient. It's our foundational knowledge and our ability to adapt and overcome our situation. It's important that tactics require a functional system to be effective. Expensive gear and outside-the-box training is not really the answer that we need. We already have 95% of what we need to do the job. Now, we just need to put it together. Now, our foundational response, as I said earlier, responding to that domestic, can be as simple as taking that hot zone, our exclusion zone, and just kind of bubbling in an embedded warm zone through law enforcement security.
Just as Jeff talked about engineering our response, one thing we have to keep in mind are those human performance capabilities we have when we're working under extreme duress, as in an active shooter event. So one thing we need to look at are those physiological, psychological, and environmental impacts that are going to have, that those will have in our response. I think without a shadow of a doubt, responding to an active shooter is going to be a psychologically stressful event, one you may not even face in your career. With that, there's going to be a tremendous amount of physiological change. So knowing those two things, adding additional tactics that we may train on 4 hours, once a year, even once every other year, is not the time to be doing it. A resource you can use is Warfighting, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication #1. In fact, at the FDIC conference a couple of years ago, the presenter did a 4-hour presentation just on the 9 principles of warfare. There's an acronym that goes with that, which is MOOSMUS. I'm not going to go into all of that in this presentation, but clearly the implications of that have a correlation to how we should construct our response. Let me just kind of close this up here. Karl von Clausewitz, noted military theorist, talked a lot about the implications of fog, of war, and friction, and so forth. And he gave really 2 key ways that we can combat that, or how we remedy that, through experience and training. So let's look at that in the context of an active shooter. The experience we have responding to active shooters is probably not that much, because they don't happen all that frequently. So again, our response should be as close as possible to our normal operating procedures. Officers respond on man with gun calls quite frequently. We respond on officer down calls, shots fired calls, and alike. So we want to look at the tactics we employ in those type of calls, and hopefully our active shooter response mirrors some of those same tactics. The last is training. And so we need to have a diligent, earnest push to train, especially when we start to integrate with our fire counterparts.
Now, just as Craig said, with fire and EMS, we don't want to learn as we go on these calls, because ultimately it causes friction and time penalties when it comes to survivability. We want to use our tactics and techniques that we use every day to be successful. So how do we move forward in active shooter events or criminal mass casualty incidences? And the way we do it is that we have systemic problem solving. And the reason why I say systemic is because this is not one agency's sole responsibility. Now, it is true that this primarily may be a law enforcement event, but it's going to go through so many different bodies. Okay? It's going to go through law enforcement, fire, EMS if they're different agencies. It's going to go through the 911 system. And the organization or location has happened. For example, a school. The school needs to have a process of how they do reunification and security. This is a systemic problem that we have in America. And to move forward as public safety, we need agency expertise. We want to utilize our law enforcement officers in the jobs that they best do. We want to use fire and EMS in the job in the fashion that they best do as far as treating patients. Okay? Through that, we need clearly defined roles. What is law enforcement going to do, and what is fire going to do? The more we start graying that and coming into the middle, we start blurring it a little bit, and we start running out of our efficiency zones. We need familiarity with each other. Law enforcement and fire, as I kind of talked about earlier, we need to come together as collaborative agencies of public safety and being able to really work well and seamlessly together. And lastly, as Craig alluded to earlier, and we'll talk about more, simplicity. The simpler we make our response, the greater chance we have for success. Sometimes simplicity is hard. It's easy to get distracted by bells and whistles. But buying the additional gear or adopting advanced tactics may not be as effective as simply sitting down with our counterparts and adopting and working on a plan together.
And just to kind of close this back up, our foundational principle of R2TM is it has to be simple. As we've talked about, and we've experienced this in police and fire, those simplest things that we do under immense stress, they're extremely difficult. And so going into this, why would we develop programs and protocols that are already difficult to achieve in training? They're bound to fail when those stress comes on. So our belief is we need to exploit and keep this simple. So what are the three foundations of R2TM? It's based on law enforcement making rapid entry, hopefully using decentralized tactics and mitigating that threat. 2, it's securing that embedded warm zone and getting fire EMS in a rapid manner. And 3, EMS and fire working together to get those patients to definitive medical care as fast as possible. And lastly, we need to keep our response as close as possible to the standard operating procedures in both police and fire. Why? Because we know those work on a day-to-day basis under stress. So here's the overview with our response, the assessment, and the security. Under response, 2 of these categories are old hat for law enforcement. Getting in there, mitigating the threat, and using that and doing that in a rapid fashion. The third one sometimes can be kind of a sticking point, and that's initiating that initial sergeant, battalion chief link-up. That grows the unified command. That's critical for this response. After response is the second phase, which is the assessment. Critical pieces in here. One is identifying that fob. We've talked to a lot of agencies out there that are using something very similar, and that's great. I don't care what you call it, but the point is that fob acts as an area where we can start to grow interior operations. We can't expect all these decisions to be made by the unified command, or at least that initial link up between the sergeant and the BC. The fob is critical to start organizing and kind of coordinating those interior operations. Finally, under the assessment phase is for law enforcement to identify that casualty collection point. And you can use 2 casualty collection points if you need to. But what that does is it allows a foundation for law enforcement on the interior to start bringing the patients to that zone. And finally are the security aspects. How do we protect fire and pull them into that embedded warm zone? This takes a couple different categories. One is the external security, which we'll talk about later, which is on-apparatus security, overwatch security, and so forth. The other is security at the casualty collection point. We want to make that area as safe as possible to allow fire to do their work. The other aspects of security are what we call overwatch security, and that what we feel with the amount of law enforcement assets we have on the interior, locking down corridors, sectioning off key geographical terrain features, and pulling patients to the CCP is a great way to maximize time. And lastly is just to introduce fire EMS and get them into the casualty collection point. We also fully recognize there may be a situation where you can't get fire EMS into a casualty collection point. Maybe it's a mall, maybe it's a movie theater, and it's completely gridlocked with cars. That's okay. There's still alternatives. We can still pull patients out to an exterior CCP if absolutely necessary. But again, our foundational response, we want to get fire into that CCP.
So to cover fire and EMS's response, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stage. The reason why we're going to stage is we want to be out of line of sight, and we want to gather all of our resources as soon as possible. And we have to stage out of line of sight because we don't want to put fire in a safety predicament, and we also don't want to interrupt or hamper any law enforcement operations. We want to, at this point, prepare for our entry. Okay? We want to make sure that we have enough resources coming, that we send kind of a reconnaissance apparatus in, and ensure that we just really set this operation up successful from the beginning. The next part is link up. Okay? And this is critical because when you look at all the after actions out there, a failed unified command is a huge problem. So we want to establish that unified command as quickly as possible. In fire, I encourage us, because we use ICS on a day-to-day basis, that we initiate this process. Next thing we want to do under the link up is we want to get that security escort. We want to ensure that we have protection going into the CCP because we don't want to put public safety at risk in this incident. And lastly, we're going to enter the warm zone. In the warm zone, this is where our MCI protocols begin, and we start transporting those patients as quickly as possible.
All right, like we talked about in our last video, this is just a quick review of the law enforcement response. So first, law enforcement makes a very aggressive, assertive entry into the structure and mitigates that threat. 2, that's predicated upon moving quickly to the last known intelligence where that threat was at and verifying if the suspect's there. If not, we can start to work backwards. And again, understanding the difference between sweeps and clears. Law enforcement has done a good job kind of differentiating between these two. These should just be real quick sweeps and not spending the time diving down and clearing. That takes way too long. And what are those immediate threat indicators? I think law enforcement does need to kind of understand that those immediate threat indicators are predicated upon active sounds of gunfire or reliable intelligence that the shooter is somewhere. We have to be careful not to chase our tails too much because that wastes time. And like we previously talked about, FOBs or that forward operating base are extremely useful in kind of setting that foundation for interior operations. If we look back over the last dozens and dozens of years, there's only been about 35, 36 incidents where law enforcement has had instant feedback that they've mitigated the threat, aka they've shot the threat. The question is, what happens when we can't find the threat? Maybe they've killed themselves. Maybe they've fled. When we talk about threat mitigation, what that means is barring those immediate threat indicators, shooting, reliable intelligence that shooter's somewhere, barring those, we need to start to shift gears and ramp up to get fire EMS in there. We go on the belief that if we're not having those immediate threat indicators, that our suspect is either fled, dead, or there's positive feedback we've shot him. The other beauty, I think, with this model is that even if we still have an active threat on the inside, you still potentially could pull up a casualty collection point because it's embedded and it's secured and run that simultaneously. If you have a hostage, like we saw in Platte Canyon, Colorado several years back, even the Navy Yard shooting, if the active shooter event itself is far enough removed where we could keep that separate from the casualty collection point, you can run both those events simultaneously. And what we found through numerous trainings and even some real-life experience is the FOB is absolutely critical. Because law enforcement is really given wide open authority to respond with as much assets as possible in those first 5-10 minutes, quite frankly, you can have too much asset on scene, which can encumber and slow down the process. That FOB, again, it just allows for those interior operations to be a little bit more strategic about where we're routing the officers, what needs attention, what doesn't need attention, what we've swept. And from that really lays the foundation for the casualty collection point to grow from. And lastly, please don't confuse the FOB with incident command or unified command. Those are two very distinct functions. Quite frankly, a FOB can be one sergeant. Think of it in the context of almost a hall boss in a SWAT environment. It's one person grabbing some territory, making some decisions, and routing those troops where they need to be routed to. Corridor lockdown, another huge tactic that law enforcement has to embrace and start using more effectively, especially if you're an agency with limited resources. Again, what we found, certainly through numerous studies, our own experience with training and incidents alike, is that because officers are so geared and diligent in wanting to find that threat, we end up in some cases kind of just tracking over ourselves. Corridor lockdown, once those immediate threat indicators have subsided, starts to lock down the territory and brings scene stabilization. And from there, you can get into the casualty collection point. So what do I mean by corridor lockdown? Quite simply, it's one officer with the rifle locking down a corridor. And quite frankly, you own that territory. If a bad guy to emerge, we own it. How that is much more beneficial, even looking at one of the principles of war, economy of force, is it takes much fewer officers to control much larger geographical areas, which sets the stage for victim transfer to the casualty collection point. Some may say that, that's unrealistic. How can one officer with the rifle own this entire territory with numerous ancillary rooms coming off of it? Well, quite frankly, it comes down to a very simple principle of action versus reaction. Here you have an officer set, ready, his intentional focus is downranged, ready to receive a threat. To the contrary, the suspect or the bad guy that moves into that area doesn't know you're there. And now he is behind the time curve to even react to you. Guys and gals out there, simply corridor lockdown has huge benefit once those immediate threat indicators have subsided. Get in, lock the corridors down, it builds upon itself so we can get to casualty collection.
What can we say about unification of commands? The first thing is, it's paramount. When you review a lot of the active shooters that have happened in America, this is a friction point where it doesn't always come into fruition. It needs to be physical in design. We urge caution away from any incident command system that has two different commanders in various different spots of a geographic area. It does not work. Ultimately, it's a sergeant and a battalion chief or duty chief is ideal. Essentially, fire understands incident command system very well. Matter of fact, we cannot operate outside of the incident command system, which means that we have to work together.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for police, we just need to embrace that. The command, the ICS structure as it is, works great. We just have to get with our fire counterparts and work within that system. And really, again, I think for police, don't view it as this large monolithic entity, the unified command. This is a quick relationship initially between a firefighter and a police officer that sets the stage for this thing to work.
Let's talk a little bit more about the casualty collection point. First, let's talk about the benefits of it. It's an efficient prioritization. It allows us to have all of the problem at hand in one central location, which is extremely beneficial when you have a heavy amount of resources coming in. It's a simple concept. So if we go back to what Craig was talking about earlier, that even the simplest things, when put under stress, can become the hardest, it's a little bit more manageable then. It's low cost, has enhanced security, allows fire and EMS to be protected by a secured security asset. And it's also quick connect. This primarily is a law enforcement event. It allows fire and EMS to just come in a quick disconnect, perform our operation, then disconnect and move on. The casualty collection point essentially provides a bridge between law enforcement and fire. The beauty of it is it requires no additional gear and very minimal training to make effective. It allows for simultaneous operations. Law enforcement can do law enforcement things, fire and EMS can do fire things. At this point, this incident is a three-legged race. It's a proven military tactic. That's where this comes from, as well as a lot of our other EMS tactics. It requires very minimal unified command and control. Since all of our resources in one location, we don't have many moving parts to this. It's not an over-engineered response. It allows for a simpler time managing the incident from the incident commander or unified command. And lastly, you can have multiple CCPs if needed. We do urge caution, though, on having too many additional layers of operations. So if we can put all of our victims in one CCP, that's the optimum choice. If it doesn't work because of geographical concerns or a widespread area, then it is acceptable to have multiple CCPs. To talk about a couple of the key elements of the CCP and the location, the most important thing is law enforcement is going to identify it. And the reason why we have law enforcement identify it is because they're working in the hot zone. They know the structure. And essentially at this point, they're the reconnaissance for fire and EMS, trying to tell us where we might be able to mitigate all these victims in one area. Once fire comes in, we're going to establish it. And the reason why fire establishes it is that if it doesn't meet our needs for triage, treatment and transport, then we're going to have to change the location. For example, we can't do all those operations in a broom closet. The CCP is not necessarily victim dependent, meaning that we're not going to put the CCP where we have the largest cluster of victims. We need to identify where's the appropriate ingress and egress route for fire and EMS to come into. The ability to secure. We need to be able to work fire and EMS in a secured area and have law enforcement officers lock down an area that drops our risk potential. As I said, adequate space. We cannot perform adequate triage, treatment, transport in a small area. We might need a larger area, for example, a front foyer or a gymnasium. The CCP should be located on the interior, and that's due to the external walls and ways to make it a little bit more secure for fire and EMS. But we also want to protect against the environment. For example, if it's cold outside. We don't want to put our victims in jeopardy because of environmental concerns. And lastly, you can have a CCP if you have a hostage situation or a barricade. And we allow law enforcement officers to push that area, wherever that barricade is, and secure a zone so that we can come back and have very little risk potential to perform our operations. Within the CCP, we want a clean workspace. Similar to your office or your workshop at home, the nicer and cleaner things are laid out, the more effective we can be in that area. And to specifically speak to this is our treatment zones. If we identify and separate our treatment zones, not too far, but we make it clean and organized, it allows us to be more effective than if we put all of our patients in one location. We want to reduce the desire to overcomplicate. I mean, as I said before, we do this tech rescue in every other fashion in the fire service. We love to buy gear. We love to set things up. We're very hands-on, tangible people. However, with an MCI, the more working pieces we have and space in between those working pieces takes time and effort. And do we have the time and effort to be able to conduct the operations? In the CCP, we want only essential personnel. This isn't an area that we want people conglomerating into one location and not doing anything. This is a chaotic environment that we have to have a systematic process to reduce that chaos. A good example is all of our green patients, our walking wounded, or our non-injured. This is not an area that we want them. We want to push them off into another area that we can secure or outside the building so we can conduct our operations. And lastly, we need to get into the philosophical conversation. Should we scoop and run or stay and play? Now, as we identified earlier through plenty of trauma studies and the WMET studies, the longer we wait on scene, the higher mortality rate we'll have. And so we don't want to delay any critical patient from being transported. So if we can transport them immediately, let's do it. But we don't want to sit there and focus on all of our treatment areas and going through an algorithmic process before we transport them out. My counterpart, Craig, and I both argue that any action going on within the structure is going to be the hot zone. That's why we've created this embedded warm zone. So anything outside of that embedded warm zone is going to be hot. So to specifically speak to hot zone medical care, EMS is not going to go into those areas. EMS is going to stay in the warm zone. So any medical care that might be performed in the hot zone is going to be done by law enforcement. And we can do this through the use of tourniquets. Tourniquets are a very easy and cheap application for any extremity hemorrhage care. Now, this also follows the TECC recommendations that we urge you to look into. Now, these victims that law enforcement find in the hot zone are going to transfer them to the CCP. And they're going to do this through a hasty field triage. Now, I say hasty because we're not training law enforcement on how to do an algorithmic triage, example being START or ABC. Now, law enforcement is going to use their gut instinct of identifying who they think the most injured are and bring them to the CCP first. Now, to reiterate, law enforcement, because they're operating within the hot zone, if they find somebody who's bleeding from an extremity wound, they can apply a tourniquet and transfer them to the CCP. If there's no need for a tourniquet, then those victims may also be transferred to the CCP. But we are asking officers to find the people they find to be the most severe wounded and have them transferred to the CCP first. Because we're not going to be getting into airway care and a couple other interventions in the hot zone, we're having law enforcement transfer the victims to the CCP because it is resource driven. They are generally a larger resource on scene than we have fire and EMS initially. And it's also supported by the 9 principles of warfare, which give us a good operational platform to stand on. Tourniquets are an effective way to combat extremity bleeding. As we said before, they're easy to train and they're relatively inexpensive. Some of the studies out there that have been done have shown up to a 90% associated survival rate when applied to people who are presenting the signs of shock. Meaning that if law enforcement is not carrying them on themselves today in a daily routine, we urge that they should. And the reason why is it's perfect for buddy and self-rescue on any incident. And as far as EMS, this should be in addition to all of our medical kits because it's easy to apply. Most all of these studies show that there's actually a 0 amputation rate if applied correctly. As fire and EMS prepares for entry, obviously we want to stage out a line of sight, but we also want to develop a little bit of reconnaissance. So we can do this 2 ways. One, we can do that through communication in our interoperability. And then the second thing is once we have the gear and we are ready to respond in, we only want to send a minimal amount of resources at first with our law enforcement security. And this reason is we want to ensure that we're going to the right location, there are no hazards, and everything we need is being set up correctly. Otherwise, it's hard to undo something once we've sent our whole boat of resources in. Lastly, we want to take only the needed equipment to get the job done. This is not the time for our LifePak 12 monitors or other things that we do regular in EMS. This is where we're only going to need things for exsanguination care, airway management, backboards, devices to help move people. Follow your MCI protocols and make sure that we're doing this effective. As we get into the command link up, okay, we urge fire and EMS to initiate this link up with law enforcement because we're operating in this environment day to day and we can help that ball get rolling. Okay? We're going to request this link up over the interoperable radio channel, which we'll get into in a little bit. The location of this needs to be outside of the hazard zone. We don't want this link up to be even in the warm zone. It should be in your support zone. And it should be done by capable members. Now remember, in ICS structure, rank does not matter. We just need capable members. And we suggest that on the fire side, this is a fire officer, a battalion chief, or a chief. On the law enforcement side, it could be as simple as a sergeant, lieutenant, up to commander. but it should be physical. We urge caution on not performing a physical link-up. Now, we also identify that this might have to take place as we get into the incident, but it should always become physical. And lastly, let's simplify the ICS structure. We don't need to overcomplicate this into like a type 1 incident. This at most is a type 3, maybe type 4 incident, which does not require much complexity. So how do we communicate with each other? It's important, as set forth by Homeland Security Presidential Directive Number 5, that we are able to have interoperability of radio communications between fire, law enforcement, EMS, any other agency coming to this problem. Now, as we've traveled around, we've found a lot of people think that they have the ability to communicate, but ultimately do not. Okay? We need to be able to talk and listen to each other. Now, if we don't have this, it could set the incident up to jeopardy if we hinge on this variable. Ultimately, we should be working on daily operations of that ability to communicate through a communications plan between various agencies. Now, if we're hinging on that variable and communications, for say, go down, are our responders going to be able to integrate? Some of the response models out there are not able to because it requires very in-depth communications. Now we say, because sometimes these instances, our trunk systems or whatever other problems we might have, may fail, so we have to go to a simplex, being line of sight. Now if we go to a simplex line of sight, we can easily do this through this model of pairing up a fire officer and a law enforcement officer to kind of be an internal communication with each other to an external source.
And look, here's one of the key pieces with this integration. Will your comms work? If the comms go down because of overloaded trunk systems, interoperable frequencies, unified command has not quite come to fruition, will the integration come together? And what we found through extensive testing and training through the R2TM model is that we don't need to rely quite so heavily on those communications between us and unified command. If they're non-existent, it's still fairly easy to bring fire into an embedded warm zone as compared to sending rescue teams in various areas of the structure, which clearly depend heavily on communications from that cell back to unified command. Let's review real quick the components of fire security. It's made up of 3 succinct areas, both exterior security, overwatch security, and security that police provide at the casualty collection point. Under apparatus security, that can take one of 3 forms. We can provide physical security with the truck or the EMS unit, which we actually really do encourage, because even if unified command is having difficulty coming together and establishing their comms plan, now you have a police officer and an engine lieutenant or a captain in face-to-face contact, verifying the approach route, has it been secured, what are my threats like inside, and so forth. The other aspect of apparatus security would just be an escort. Merely you're going to use your patrol vehicle and bring the fire asset in. The last one is just that security that we can provide through Overwatch. These could be stable counter sniper positions along the ingress-egress route, just protecting the facade of the structure while fire comes in. And lastly, the casualty collection point security. Again, this is very intuitive for law enforcement officers. These are just strategic locations for law enforcement in dedicated positions protecting the fire operations in the CCP.
To speak a little bit more in depth about our MC operations and medical care in the CCP, the one question we should all be asking ourselves is, will our triage method hamper our time? After speaking with multiple of these agencies who have had an active shooter event in their area, they said that, when we're following your standard algorithmic process of triaging, it takes too much time. And so we suggest that we take a look back at our process and identify if there's a quicker way that we could do it. Our triage patients may also shift categories on you. Remember, your yellow patients may become red patients and vice versa. We only want to fix major problems. We do not want to delay transport of critical patients. So let's only fix those critical things that we need and then ship the patients off to definitive medical care. Look into our TEC guidelines and also our PHTLS guidelines. Are we going to work trauma codes? If we have the resources, and this always becomes a sticky subject for people, if we have the resources available, we are able to work these trauma codes. If we do not have the resources available, we have to follow back on our MCI protocols and understand there's not much we can do for those people. And lastly, we want to monitor our available resources. Call your resources in early. Call as many as you can and let the hospitals and all the receiving entities know what's going on. interference with transport happens. And it happens on many of our large events. It also happens on many of our small events. Okay? What the interference with transport does is it increases our victim scene time, and it also increases our victims out of hospital time. Once this interference with transport occurs, it requires more resources to undo. Okay? And it creates damage to the scene. So it's important that we as fire and EMS get together with our law enforcement counterparts and show them why this is a problem for us and how we can work together to minimize this interference. How do we minimize this interference between agencies? The first thing we can do is pre-plan and pre-train. If we get all this information out front and we work together, we will for surely minimize this. And if it doesn't, on the day of the incident, we can work through unified command on either side of that of the agency expertise to undo whatever problem might come or has become.
Let me just kind of piggyback on what Jeff talked about in terms of how we park for police. It may even sound silly that we're even going to talk about parking in an active shooter integration piece, but it is critical that law enforcement, if we recognize we need to get fire in, and in worst case, we may have to get patients out to fire, we need to have an egress-ingress that's been protected and secured. And what that can look like, again, if we have a fairly aggressive insert of fire coming into the casualty collection point, that egress-ingress protection builds on itself, and that becomes a corridor from which we can rely upon. If cops, if you're coming in there and your only goal is to get in and take out the shooter and you're forgetting our fellow brothers and sisters in fire, it's going to get clogged up, and that's going to pose some problems. And remember what we talked about just a little bit ago in the presentation, how some of the best laid plans on paper can fall apart. This is an example of that. Police and law enforcement, we just have to be mindful about parking strategically, and what we tell our officers is get off the asphalt. Keep it clear so we can get fire in.
Let's talk briefly about where the patients go, our destination etiquette. Okay? It's important that we do not shift the MCI from our incident to another, and that will happen through blind transportation. Okay? We see this in some of the other incidences, and it may have been successful, it may not have been. But the moment we start shifting patients to hospitals without a system or a process and those entities being able to receive them, we have now shifted the MCI, which may be detriment to those patients. We can easily mitigate this through assigning somebody to communicate with the receiving hospitals and understanding what their capabilities are of that time. And lastly, document as much patient information as possible. We might not be able to gather everything, and we do not want to hamper our transport times by gathering this information, but the families and the receiving entities will greatly appreciate anything we can get. So how do we solve this problem? Through our incident command system, we might already have our triage, treatment, and transport coordinators. Now we can add a destination coordinator who purely works with transport and the receiving hospitals to ensure that the patients are distributed appropriately. It's way too easy for the patients to end up outside in the chaos of things. We do urge a lot of caution here. One, for the security of those patients to ensure further harm is not done to them from an external source. The other thing is from an environmental source. We want to keep them inside an area that they can be warm. For example, if it's freezing outside or it's extremely cold, if a patient's internal temperature drops below 32 degrees centigrade, there is a 0% survivability after a traumatic injury. Now, where this happens quite often is after patients are treated in the treatment zone and they end up kind of in a line waiting for transport out. That time on the concrete, that time outside may be a detriment to them. So we suggest keep them inside until it's go time. Now we need to commit to the response. Essentially, we need to create a response that your jurisdiction can use on a daily basis. And we use the example of a domestic assault. We built a lot of this around something we do day in and day out, and then we can expand it as needed for a criminal mass casualty incident. Make sure your neighbors can plug into your model. If your model is hinging on the variable that only a select group of people are able to conduct the operations, there's a high chance it may fail if this incident happens on the edge of your boundaries, which requires mutual aid, or if you have another incident that's requiring too many of your resources. Make sure your neighbors can plug in.
I agree, and then absolutely, guys, keep this thing simple. Like we talked about in the presentation, this is going to be a chaotic event, one you may not even face in your career. So the way we integrate needs to be simple and it needs to be effective. And lastly, the training component. It's very important with this type of integration training because it affects police, fire, EMS, 911, that we all train on it.
Remember, this is a public safety three-legged race. We have to work together, maintain swim lanes, and rely on our agency expertise to be effective.